Chapter 16. After leaving Pat and Sam at the Pony Express way station, Pinky Wright jogged along towards home, leading the two stray horses behind him. Dusk was deepening into a velvety darkness, and Pinky was quite tired. He was too tired to do much thinking about Harlow and Ezra and all that mix-up. Pinky Wright was a forthright sort of person without an ounce of guile in his wiry body. He'd felt a surge of rightness anger when the VX rider told him about Harlow bringing in a mortgage signed by Ethan Page, when he knew that Ethan had refused to sign the mortgage, and he immediately jumped to the conclusion that Harlow had seized the opportunity to forge Ethan's signature after his death. The realization that he was the only person in the valley who knew about this gave Pinky a feeling of importance. If Ezra hadn't been definitely recognized as the murderer of those people, Pinky might have suspected Harlow. As it was, he didn't actually suspect the wealthy Texan of murder. He just sort of said that to Sam and Pat to make them feel a little better about their partner. Pinky just thought Harlow was smart enough to turn Ethan Page's death to his own advantage when he heard about it. And Pinky had an idea he'd have a visit from Harlow before the night was over. That was why he had been careful to tell the VX rider that he hadn't yet told his story to everyone, and was too tired to bother telling it to anyone tonight. With that knowledge, Pinky figured Harlow would have to come by to see him tonight if he was guilty of forging the signature. He'd probably try and buy him off, Pinky thought happily. He envisioned Eustace Harlow down on his knees begging him to keep quiet about the whole thing. That should be quite pleasant. He hated Harlow's guts and would enjoy nothing more than telling him to go to hell. Pinky wasn't worried about Harlow, what might do after he refused. He had vast contempt for Harlow and didn't think the rancher was the sort to resort to physical violence. He was the kind of man, Pinky thought, who got his way through trickery and law courts. Besides, Pinky carried a gun and knew how to use it. He certainly wasn't afraid of Harlow. But a tiny voice of inward caution had urged Pinky to share his knowledge with someone else before Harlow had a chance to get to him. And that's why he went out of his way to ride by the express station and casually tell his story to Sam. If anything did happen to him, Harlow still wouldn't get the Page ranch because now Sam and Pat knew about the forged signature as well. All in all, Pinky was quite pleased with himself as he neared his home place. Nothing, no matter what happened, Harlow's guns were spiked. And Pinky sure was looking forward to the interview with the rich rancher who thought he could use the power of his money to run the whole valley. It was going to be fun telling him off. Pinky whistled softly between his teeth as he rode up to the corral. The dark bulk of his bachelor house loomed up out of the moonlight a few 100 feet away. He pulled out of his saddle, loosened the girth, and pulled saddle and sweaty blanket off, and dropped the saddle on the ground on its side so that the saddle skirts wouldn't get mashed out of shape. He led his mount and the two stray grays to the corral gate, swung it open, and pulled the bridle off his own horse, and then led the other two up and slipped the nooses from their necks. They trotted eagerly past him into the corral, and nosed the empty feed box, and then tossed their heads and neighed hopefully. He laughed, went to the barn, dragged out a bale of alfalfa. He broke the 3 wires holding the bale together and tossed half of it over the fence into the box feed, and then walked up to the house whistling softly. His house consisted of 2 small rooms in which Pinky lived quite comfortably. A confirmed bachelor, he had everything down to a set routine, and it didn't take much effort the way he kept house. He lit a lantern by the door, hung it on a nail overhead the room that served him as a kitchen, dining, sitting area, then shook out the ashes in the grate, threw some pieces of dry mesquite root into the firebox, and doused it with kerosene and dropped in a lit match. He stepped back to avoid the sheet of flame that burst upward, waiting until the fire burned steadily, and then replaced the lid. He pulled an iron pot of boiled frioli beans from the back to the front of the stove, poured a little more water in the pot, and gave her a stir. He threw a handful of fresh coffee on top of the old grounds in the coffee pot and put in 3 cups of fresh water, and then got a pan of stale baking powder biscuits that had been cooked 2 days previous and sprinkled them with water. He slid them into the oven to soften and heat, and he had finished his simple preparations for supper. Women fussed too much about cooking and all, Pinky thought. A woman thought she had to cook up things fresh for every meal, when his experience had taught him that beans and bread and coffee were always more tasty the oftener they were warmed over, and it sure saved a hell of a lot of time, too. While his supper was heating, he took the lantern and tin bucket out to the barn and milked his Jersey. He quit after drawing off a little more than a quart into his bucket, and then turned the cow's eager calf in to finish the job. Tending a cow was something Pinky didn't waste much effort on. Other folks, they milked a cow dry and then turned around and fed the excessive milk to the calf out in a pan. That seemed mighty foolish to Pinky. He didn't see any reason to interfere with nature. Why shouldn't a man just take what he needed and then let the calf work for the rest of it? Sure seemed to save a lot of trouble and fuss. He carried his fresh milk back to the kitchen, tested the beans. They were bubbling gently and emitting a slightly sour odor. Pinky sniffed at them twice to assure himself that they weren't too sour to taste good. As long as they tasted good, he didn't see any reason to throw them out. He figured that boiling them that way killed all the germs, and that way they never made him sick. This pot of beans had been first cooked 4 days previous, and he was getting down to the bottom of the pot. He decided he had best try to finish them off tonight and then set a new pot for soaking. The coffee was boiling furiously, and it gave off a vicious odor, not unlike a crock of lye at soap-making time. Pinky nodded approvingly, and his nostrils twitched in appreciation. A fella, he could get his teeth into that there coffee. None of that fresh brewed, aspired stuff for him. Then he turned out the beans into a big round bowl, and set the coffee pot and a cup down beside on the table, pulled the pan of heated biscuits from the oven. The biscuits were sort of hard in the middle, but he broke them up into the bowl of beans and went to work with a tablespoon, washing the slightly sour concoction down with draughts of coffee that probably would have taken the enamel off the teeth of a less hardy man. Pinky felt much better after he cleaned up the beans. He left a couple of biscuits for breakfast and drained off the last cup of coffee from the pot that was still half full of grounds, and settled back with a sigh of satisfaction to roll a cigarette. It was mighty nice not to be bothered by women folk and their finicky ways. Look at old Sam Sloane over there, he thought, worried as a bee in a tar bucket about that she of his, just because she's due to drop a baby. Had to have a doctor from town and all. Just as if nature hadn't intended women to have babies. He lit a cigarette and threw the match into a corner piled high with caked mud, cigarette butts, and charred matchsticks. He swept the room once every week, piled all the debris into one corner until the mound got so high that it spread out onto the floor, and then he got his shovel and shoveled it out. He had to do this once every 6 months or so, and it seemed like a neat solution to the housekeeping problem. The lantern swung gently overhead, cast a grotesque shadow of Pinky upon the wall behind him. It was very still in the small, isolated ranch house, and Pinky kept glancing at the open window across the length of the room, and he was subconsciously straining his ears to catch the sound of approaching hoof beats that would warn him that a visitor was coming. He thought it was about time for Harlow to get there. A VX rider had had plenty of time to get to the ranch and tell the boss what Pinky had said, and it wasn't more than an hour's ride from the VX to Pinky's place. He shifted his chair back from the table slightly so his right hand was free to reach for his holstered shooting iron. He didn't really expect Eustace Harlow to come a-shooting, but you could never tell with a man like that. Harlow acted soft and inoffensive, but that just might be a cover-up for something else. It was just as well to be ready for anything, Pinky figured. He was very comfortable as he sat, waiting for Harlow to come. His belly was full, and his mind was at rest. He looked forward to the interview. He grinned happily as he anticipated it, still keeping his ears keen for any sound outside the house. It seemed to him it was unnaturally quiet out there. The moon had risen, and there should be, by rights, some crickets or katydids outside the window singing a cheery song of welcome like they did almost every night, but tonight they weren't singing. Not a sound came through the open window. It was kind of funny. Not even the howling wail of a coyote from a distant ridge. It seemed like, by golly, that all the animals and night insects were holding their breath, as if waiting for something to happen. Pinky Wright stirred uneasily in his chair. He wasn't a superstitious man, but this unnatural silence was beginning to get under his skin. It was as though he was alone, and was left alive in a dead world of silence. He felt his hair begin to prickle and the rise on the back of his neck. He could dang near hear the silence, by golly. It was ominous and important that almost the chills ran up and down his spine. He told himself that he was crazy, but beads of sweat were beginning to stand on his face. He impatiently pushed his coffee cup back and started to get up. Half erect, he froze in that position, leaning forward with blunt fingertips resting lightly on the table in front of him. What was that sound outside? Or was that even a sound? It was like the furtive crunch of a boot heel in the soft earth under the window. But it wasn't repeated. He wasn't even sure he heard anything. Maybe his nerves, they were playing tricks on him, but it was sure of a hell of a time to be developing nerves. He was getting as bad as a scary old woman, jumping at every imagined sound. He straightened up resolutely and he stared across the room at the red whiskered and contorted face of Ezra outside his window. The one eye socket was vacant, and the other was inflamed with murderous fury. The face seemed disembodied, as though it floated in the night air outside the window. The illusion was strengthened by the soundlessness which it had appeared there, as though it was an evil spirit that had materialized out of the night. Pinky Wright was hypnotized by the suggestion of the noxious evil that flamed towards him with the single eye outside the window. He was powerless to even move. He knew what was happening, but he couldn't do anything to avert what was to come. It was like he was suddenly standing off to the side and watching his own body. He felt sorry for himself, but there was nothing he could do. He had to just stand there and watch Pinky Wright die. He saw the muzzle of a gun slowly appear out of the darkness just below the window's edge. It steadied on him, and he waited for it to belch death in his direction. Curiously, he wasn't afraid. It seemed like all of his emotions were dead, as if he was already dead. Nothing mattered anymore. He wanted Ezra to shoot and get it over with. He wondered if the others had felt that way. He wondered why Ezra had singled him out for his next victim when he was only trying to do the one-eyed man a favor. He wanted to shout to him that he was making a mistake, but he couldn't open his mouth to even form the words. He stood like that and waited for Ezra to fire. He saw a movement behind the big red-whiskered man, just a suggestion of movement in the silvery moonlight, and then the blow descended upon Ezra's head. The menacing .45 exploded as Ezra went down, and a bullet buried into the wall behind Pinky, and the loud report released him from the grip of the unseen force that held him motionless. He lunged towards the window, drawing his gun as he ran. A figure straightened up and confronted him. It was Pat Stevens. He said curtly, "That'll be all for now, Pinky. I got him in time. Come on out and help me load him into my buckboard, and then we'll haul him into town, where there'll be a lynchy party waiting for him." Pinky turned, ran around to the door and outside. He didn't understand any of it. He didn't know how either Ezra or Pat had got there, nor why they were. But Pat's cold voice told him that it was up now with Ezra. This time he had been caught in the act of attempted murder, and he would have to pay the price. Pat met him at the corner of the house. "I'll get the buckboard and drive up so we can load him up. I've tied my team down by the crick and slipped up quiet, because I figured this was due to happen." Pat trotted down towards the creek before Pinky had a chance to ask any questions. He walked on around the corner and stopped beside the bulky, crumpled body on the ground. He knelt and felt for the pulse and found it strong. It was clear that his attacker was just knocked out and would live long enough to be hanged. This saddened Pinky. He thought it was too danged bad that Pat hadn't finished the job right then and there. He always liked Ezra. It seemed like a pity that he had to end up this way. Pat came driving up on the buckboard, and he leapt out to use his one good arm to help Pinky load the big man into the back of the buckboard. Pat was grim and silent, and Pinky respected his silence as they both climbed up into the front seat and started for Dutch Springs. He knew Pat must be feeling pretty bad about the whole thing. Heck, he felt pretty bad about his own self. End of chapter 16.